NBC Sunday Night at the Movies will return following these messages.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is John Dancy, NBC News.
Good evening. U.S. Envoy Vernon Walters met with European allies today seeking support for American retaliation against Libya. No word on what that retaliation might be. Syria said today it will support Libya against any U.S. attack. Syria did not spell out what that means. The Associated Press says the CIA has been secretly funding Nicaraguan Contras in political projects over the past few years. And Pope John Paul visited a Jewish synagogue in Rome today, an unprecedented attempt to heal 2,000 years of discord between Jews and Roman Catholics. I'm John Dancy in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Lemon Tree from Lipton. Now here is John Dancy.
Good evening. Edmund Muskie was sworn in as Secretary of State at a ceremony tonight at the White House. President Tito of Yugoslavia was buried today after hundreds of thousands of his countrymen and world leaders watched his funeral procession through the streets of Belgrade. Heavy artillery fire broke out near Beirut tonight, apparently part of a continuing Israeli attack on PLO guerrillas. Defense Secretary Harold Brown today refused to tell senators plans of the American hostage rescue attempt. He said it could compromise some future raid. Balloonist Maxie Anderson and his son are aloft over the western desert tonight, trying to reach Kitty Hawk, North Carolina 4 days from now and become the first to cross the country by balloon. I'm John Dancy in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
Lemon Tree, it's from Lipton, got that fresh squeezed lemon taste. Try Lemon Tree, the lemonade flavored drink mix with fresh squeezed taste from Lipton.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Michelob Beer. Here is Connie Chung, NBC News.
Good evening. The FAA said tonight a Delta jetliner missed colliding with a twin-engine plane by 30 to 50 feet today over northern Virginia. The jetliner was bound from Washington to Atlanta. An American Olympic sweep in the men's 200-meter final tonight and a third gold medal for Carl Lewis. Kirk Baptiste silver and Thomas Jefferson bronze. Now this.
A taste so smooth it could only be Michelob. Some things speak for themselves.
American delegate James Buckley told a Mexico City population conference tonight that the U.S. may withhold aid for UN-sponsored Third World family planning unless the U.S. receives guarantees the money won't be spent on abortions or forced limits on families. I'm Connie Chung in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Budweiser. Here is Richard Valeriani, NBC News.
Good evening. Responding to questions from NBC News, Soviet President Chernenko said if the White House is sincere, the two superpowers can start moving toward more normal relations. But he added the time for a summit meeting is not yet ripe. General William Westmoreland testified today that he had not underestimated enemy troop strength in Vietnam. This during his libel suit against CBS and his second day on the stand. Now this.
This bud's for everyone who scrapes it, sprays it, and lays it on smooth.
This bud's for you. Salvadoran rebel leaders say they may declare a unilateral ceasefire during the Christmas season. A perfect landing today for Discovery. It carried 2 rescued satellites at the end of the first ever salvage mission in space. I'm Richard Valeriani in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Colorals. Here is Bob Kerr, NBC News.
Good evening. In Chile, the Archbishop of Santiago attacked the current crackdown by the military government in a letter read by priests during Sunday Mass. On the eve of talks in Mexico between U.S. and Nicaraguan officials, that country's foreign minister accused the Reagan administration of whipping up hysteria against Nicaragua. Nicaraguan leader Daniel Ortega has called for a meeting with President Reagan, but today a White House spokesman said no. Now this.
Help keep your world looking smooth and colorful. Wear Colorals.
7 search planes flew over a wide stretch of ocean off New Jersey and Delaware today. Still no sign of a fishing trawler and 9-man crew missing since Wednesday. I'm Bob Kerr in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by High Pro brand dog food. Here is Bob Kerr, NBC News.
Good evening. A sigh of relief tonight in Northern California. The bow section of a broken tanker carrying millions of gallons of oil was towed safely into San Francisco Bay. With Israeli and Lebanese military officials meeting again tomorrow, Lebanon's state radio is reporting that within 10 days, its army will take control of a key coastal road in southern Lebanon. Now this.
My dog's healthy and it shows 'cause he's got the High Pro Glow. Healthy, High Pro Glow, energy, the High Pro Glow.
Purina brand High Pro dog meal.
A candy scare in England. A militant animal rights group claims to have injected rat poison in Mars chocolate bars to protest medical experiments on monkeys. So far, 7 bars with warning notes have been found. I'm Bob Kerr in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Black Tower Wine. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. Explosions and fire in Mexico City. At least 261 people were killed, at least 500 seriously injured when a gas tank facility went up in a series of fireballs. The death toll is expected to rise as search teams dig through the rubble. Fire aboard a military helicopter at Camp Lejeune killed 3 and injured at least 12 others. The chopper was on a routine training mission. Federal figures out today show personal income up 0.6%, while consumer spending dropped 0.1%, the first drop since last February. And former Senator George Aiken of Vermont died today at the age of 92. He spent 5 decades in politics, 34 years in the Senate. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest. Here is Chuck Scarborough, NBC News.
Good evening. In Washington, a senior official told NBC News that Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko and Secretary of State Schultz are very close to resuming arms control talks. Another source said a Reagan-Chernyenko summit may also be on the agenda. Israel today rejected Lebanon's demand for up to $10 billion in war reparations as their talks continued on a withdrawal of Israeli troops. Former Israeli Defense Minister Sharon testified he said not one word to encourage the 1982 Palestinian massacre in Beirut. He's suing Time magazine for libel. And in his suit against CBS, General Westmoreland described his interview with Mike Wallace as an ambush, a lynching. I'm Chuck Scarborough in New York. More news later on this NBC station.